So, we already know both the 4070 Super and the 7900 Jerry since I reviewed those cards not so long ago, but reviews are done in about 15 games, but what does it look like when we expand the panel to 50 games at 1440p? Well, let's see that. So, for this video, it will be a little different from what I usually do for my reviews, where I mainly look at the performance graphs. Here, we are going to look at video gameplay and the 21:9 format, which allows you to see a little more of each gameplay window. So I won't get back to the technical aspect of the card and so on here. There will be performance summary at the end of the video, which we will observe quickly, since we are not going to watch all the 50 games on video either, since that will make a very long video. The settings used are shown on screen each time, but roughly speaking, for competitive games, it's often medium or competitive settings, and for solo or more AAA games, it's most often high details. We also have RT test and upscalers, and the scenes that you will see are often the spots which are used for my benchmarks, but it's not the runs which are used to make the stats, since when you are benchmarking, you avoid displaying the overlays as it eats a bit of performances. And so we begin with Assetto Corsa Competizione, and while most of the time the Radeon are doing better with racing games, in this game it's not the case. The 4070 Super have a slight lead over the 7900 GRE, the frame rate is more stable on the wall, and we can also see that for the 1% they are slightly better for the 4070 Super as well. And the two cards will give you more than 200 FPS average, which is really good. And as we can also see, we are using the game TAA, which is giving really bad image quality and a lot of ghosting, so it's probably better to use some other kind of rendering technique, because it's really bad here. Moving on to Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. In this game, clearly the 4070 Super is doing better. The game uses some kind of software ray tracing, and clearly the 4070 Super is doing better here, but the game is still plenty playable on the 7900 Jerry. Moving on to Alan Wake 2 now. As we can see here, the 7900 Jerry is doing better here in medium settings in pure rasterization, but we know the GRE is doing better in those conditions. Regardless, both cards will give you playable frame rate, even if it's a clear win for the GRE here. But if we use the low ray tracing settings, we can see that now both cards are really close, even though the 7900 GRE is still doing a bit better here. But that's also because the low ray tracing settings isn't using path tracing while the other settings does, and it's a pretty light ray tracing on the low settings, so the GRE is doing pretty good. But if you use the high ray tracing settings, which is path tracing, we can see now that the 4070 Super is doing much better than the 7900 GRE, which is struggling quite a bit here. But regardless, with both cards, the frame rate is pretty low. We are under 30 FPS for the GRE and around 40 for the 4070 Super, so we will have to use upscaling. And yeah, if we use DLSS or FSR in quality mode, it's going much better frame rate wise, but we can also see that image quality wise, the 4070 Super is giving a much more stable image, which is more pleasing, and we also get a better performance because the 4070 Super is now around 60 FPS average, while the 7900 GRE is around 45, but it's playable. Battlefield 2042 now. Well, both cards are doing pretty good, even if here the 7900 GRE is having slightly better performance. Both cards will give you more than 150 FPS on average, which is plenty enough to play this game. But as we can often see, in pure rasterization, the 7900 GRE seem to often have a slight lead over the 4070 Super. For Baldurs Gate 3 now, in the third act of the game, it's a scene where the CPU performance matters a bit more, and we can see that the RTX 4070 is doing a bit better than the 7900 GRE, which is not all too surprising. The game is also running here in DirectX 11, and we know that the GeForce often does slightly better in DirectX 11 compared to the Radeons. For Modern Warfare 2 in basic settings, we can see that both cards are well above 200 FPS average, but the 7900 GRE is doing slightly better. But we can also see that as far as 1% goes, the 4070 Super is pretty close in the end, so both cards are, roughly speaking, giving you about the same experience in the end. Cyberpunk 2077, rasterization high settings, well, we can see that both cards are pretty much on par. There will slightly, I would say, for the 7900 GRE, but overall, that's pretty much exactly the same. Now, if you activate ray tracing in ultra settings, that's another story. The 4070 Super is clearly better than the 7900 Jerry, and it's a bit like what we saw with Alan Wake 2. But even if the 4070 Super is doing better here, it's still pretty low FPS average, so we will have to use upscaling to get something more playable anyway. And yeah, if you activate DLSS and FSR, we can see now that the 4070 Super is around 60-70 FPS average, while the 7900 Jerry is around 40-45 most of the time. And if we use path tracing now with Cyberpunk, it's very, very heavy, and clearly, even with upscaling here, the 7900 Jerry is unplayable. We are below 20 FPS average most of the time, and the 4070 Super is doing much better. We are around 45-50 FPS, which is not amazing, but it can be used, while the 7900 Jerry is just not powerful enough with ray tracing to handle it. Moving on to Counter-Strike 2, and as we can see here, the 4070 Super is doing better than the 7900 Jerry, but both cards will give you more than 300 FPS anyway, so it's very, very playable with both cards, even if, yeah, once again, it's a DirectX 11 game, and the GeForce are doing better most of the time at DirectX 11 games. For Warhammer Darktide, in rasterization, we can see that, once again, both cards are fairly similar. You get pretty much the same experience running the game, but if you activate ray tracing, well, the 7900 Jerry isn't doing that bad here, but clearly the 4070 Super is doing a bit better. But once again, as we saw in some other ray traced game, both cards are below the 60 FPS average, so we will have to use upscaling to get something a bit more stable and a bit more performance as well. And with DLSS and FSR quality, once again, the 4070 Super has the lead. You get better performance and you also get better image quality, so as usual with ray tracing, the GeForce cards have the advantage. For Diablo 4, well, I had tested the game at release, and what we could see back then is the game loves a lot of memory bandwidth. Both cards don't have that much of it, and they seem to be performing pretty similarly here. Sometimes the 4070 Super is ahead while doing the run, sometimes it's a 7900 Jerry, but overall, it's pretty much the same. But we got a patch not too long ago that added ray tracing to the game, and as we can see here, it just massacres the performance of the cards, because we go from around 200 FPS to like under 100 for the 4070 Super and around 60 FPS for the 7900 Jerry, and I think it's just not worth it. Image quality wise, the ray tracing doesn't bring all that much, and the performance drops so much that it's just not worth it at all. And even while using DLSS or FSR in quality mode, well, we get a bit more FPS than without, but it's still really, really far from what we got without ray tracing, so it's just totally not worth it to me. Bit of another game now, Days Gone. It's a DirectX 11 game, and back then the game wasn't doing too well with Radeon cards, but AMD improved that driver, so now it's doing pretty well, and it's even doing a bit better than the 4070 Super here. But both cards are performing well above 150 FPS, so it's totally playable with both cards here. Moving on to Dragon's Dogma 2 now. When the game released, we could see that the GeForce were doing better than the Radeon, and it's still the case now. Clearly, the 4070 Super is ahead here, and we hope that AMD will improve their drivers, or maybe the game will improve performance as well, because it's still pretty bad as far as optimization goes. And if you use ray tracing in this game, it doesn't change much performance-wise, because you only lose a couple of FPS, so it's almost like it's pretty much free. And as we can see, even if you use upscaling, it doesn't change much here either. You gain a bit of performance back, but it's pretty much the same still. I think the only important thing here is that I feel like upscaling is giving out a slightly better image quality than the base TIA of the game, which is pretty bad in my opinion, but try it out yourself and see whatever you like best. I just really don't like the TIA of the game. Dying Light 2 now, eye settings in rasterization. The 4070 Super seem to have a slight lead over the 7900 Jerry, but both cards are not really far from each other on the wall. And if we use ray tracing now, well, as usual, the 4070 Super gets the lead, but the 7900 Jerry isn't doing that bad here. It's not as comfortable as the 4070 Super, but it will handle it okay, but once again we are under the 60 FPS average without upscaling, so we will have to use it to get there. And yeah, if we use upscaling with DLSS or FSR, we can see that the 4070 Super is around 80 to 100 FPS average, while the 7900 Jerry is like between 60 and 90 FPS most of the time, but sometimes it will drop much below. Formula 1 2022 here, well, we can see that it's a win for the 7900 Jerry. We know that for racing games, most of the time the Radeons are doing better, but once again, both cards will give you over 200 FPS average, so that's plenty enough performance to play this game. If you use ray tracing now, well, we can see that the 4070 Super is slightly ahead of the 7900 Jerry, but all in all, they are both doing pretty much the same. It's just a very slight win for the 4070 Super. And if we use upscaling, well, it's pretty much the same as without. The 4070 Super still have a slight lead, but it's still pretty much the same level of performance. For Far Cry 6 at high settings, it's a win for the 7900 Jerry here. It's doing better, but both cards will play the game just fine here. And if you use ray tracing, they end up at pretty much the same level of performance. But it's also a game that's pretty light as far as ray tracing goes, and it's kind of pointless as well, so most of the time I wouldn't even use it. Final Fantasy XIV now, well, as we can see here, the 4070 Super is doing a bit better than the 7900 Jerry, and it's a DirectX 11 game once again, and as is most often the case, GeForce are doing better with DirectX 11 games, as we can see once more. Forza Horizon 5 now, it's a racing game, and as it often is the case with racing games, the Radeon are doing a bit better than the GeForce, and that's the case once more, but still, the GeForce RTX 40 series are doing better at this game than the RTX 30 series, so Nvidia improved performance with their new architecture here, but the Radeon still have the lead in this case. Moving on to the finals, it's a competitive game that released not too long ago. We are in low settings here, and as we can see, the 4070 Super seems to be doing a bit better than the 7900 Jerry, but both cards are doing well over 200 FPS average, so it's clearly playable on both cards. Moving on to God of War, well, it's a bit of an older game, it's a DirectX 11 game, but here it's a win for the 7900 Jerry, which have a slight lead in average performance, but as we can see, the 4070 Super have pretty bad 1% performance, and that's something we have seen in this game since release. The GeForce always seem to have a slight issue with the 1% performance in these games, so not much of a surprise to see the 7900 Jerry doing a bit better here. Moving on to Helldivers 2, it's a bit of a struggle to find a good spot to do some benchmarks here, so I use a tutorial to look at performance. I know it's not perfect, and I will try to find something better later on, but as we can see here, both cards are doing pretty much the same. The 7900 Jerry seem to be doing a bit better, but it's really close on the wall. We are around 120 FPS most of the time, which is pretty nice. Hitman 3 high settings rasterization, well, it's a win for the 7900 Jerry, but both cards are powerful enough to play this game without much issue. 200 FPS average, that's more than enough for this game. And if you use ray tracing in this game, that's clearly much harder for the cards, and the 4070 Super or 7900 Jerry are below 60 FPS average most of the time, so as usual, we will have to use upscaling to get something a bit more playable. And if we use upscaling, it's going much better, obviously. We are around 100 FPS average for the 4070 Super and around 60 for the 7900 Jerry, but as we can see here, performance sometimes drops below with both cards, so depending on where you are, the cards will struggle more or less. Hogwarts Legacy, rasterization, high settings, well, it's a win for the 7900 Jerry, as we can see here. We can also see that as far as 1% goes, the 4070 Super seem to drop a bit more often than the 7900 Jerry. It's a win for the Radeon here. And if you use ray tracing, as usual, it's the other way around. The 4070 Super is clearly winning now, and the 7900 Jerry is struggling quite a bit in this game, so we will have to use upscaling anyway, because the performance are a bit all over the place for the 4070 Super as well as the 7900 Jerry, but this game optimization is still really bad. And if you use DLSS or FSR, still with ray tracing, we see that both cards are doing well enough now. We are above 60 FPS most of the time, which is enough to play this game with ray tracing on. Moving on to Jedi Survivor, in rasterization, both cards are doing well enough, even if it's a heavy game on the wall, but it's a win for the 7900 Jerry in raster. And as usual, if there is a ray tracing mode, we will flip the table around. Now it's the 4070 Super that is winning, and the 7900 Jerry is slightly behind, but it's not a really EV game as far as ray tracing goes. And if you use DLSS or FSR, we are back to pretty much the same performance that we had without ray tracing, even if now the 4070 Super still have a slight lead over the 7900 Jerry. Lords of the Fallen now, an Unreal Engine 5 game. Well, as we can see, both cards are doing pretty similarly, not much of a difference. There seems to be a slight lead for the 7900 Jerry, but all in all, I would say they are performing about the same. But the game was patched up not too long ago, and performance is much better than it used to be at release, so now both cards, even without upscaling, are doing pretty okay. Flight Simulator now, well, overall both cards are pretty close, even if I think the 7900 Jerry is doing slightly better overall, but it's still really close overall. And sometimes, as we can see, the CPU performance will matter a bit more because GPU utilization will drop down, so we are slightly bottlenecked by the CPU, even if it's a 7800 X3D. It's a pretty CPU EV game, so not much of a surprise here. Back to a competitive game now, Overwatch 2, and clearly, as we can see here, the 4070 Super is doing better than the 7900 Jerry, even if, yeah, both cards are above 400 FPS anyway, so it's playable enough with both cards, but it's a win for the GeForce here. But yeah, as we saw a couple of times with competitive games, sometimes the GeForce will be ahead, sometimes it will be the 7900 Jerry. It really depends on the game, but for this one, it's a win for the 4070 Super. Plague Tale Requiem, and as we can see here, it's a win for the 7900 Jerry. We are slightly ahead of the 4070 Super. We are hanging around 80 FPS average, while the 7900 Jerry is around 90. And if we use the ray tracing shadows in this game, no surprise, the 4070 Super is now ahead of the 7900 Jerry, and we will need upscaling to get above 60 FPS most of the time. But the problem with this game is that as far as upscaling goes, there is still only DLSS and the game upscaler, and we don't really know what it's doing in quality mode. Is it the same base resolution as DLSS quality? I have no idea. So, well, it's a win for the 4070 Super. Clearly, the 7900 Jerry is behind here, but it is what it is. Rainbow Six Siege now in medium settings. Well, we can see both cards are doing well enough. We are well above 500 FPS average, but it's still a win for the 7900 Jerry that is performing slightly better here. But, well, I think there is enough performance to go on for both cards. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, eye settings, rasterization. It's a slight win for the 4070 Super here, even if the 7900 Jerry is doing well enough. Performance are pretty good too. We also saw that 1% for the GeForce in this game are not amazing. Most of the time, the Radeon are doing better. And if you use ray tracing, well, clearly it's a win once again for the 4070 Super, but I still think that the 7900 Jerry is doing pretty well here. We are not using upscaling and we are above 60 FPS average, so pretty good for the Radeon, and the GeForce really doesn't need upscaling here to handle this. But regardless, if you use upscaling anyway, well, as we can see, the 4070 Super is now above 100 FPS most of the time, and the 7900 Jerry is just below. We are hanging around 80 to 100 FPS most of the time, so that's clearly playable. So pretty good for both cards here. Red Dead Redemption 2, it's a bit of an older game now, but it's still a really nice looking game. So we can see here that the 7900 Jerry is doing slightly better, but it's not exactly miles ahead, I would say. So the 4070 Super is just slightly behind, like we saw in most games in rasterization. That's the case once again. But as usual, we are well above 100 FPS average, that's plenty enough for this game. Remnant 2 now, it's another Unreal Engine 5 game, so as we can see with eye settings, the 7900 Jerry is having better performance, but image quality wise, this game's TAA is really bad. And you get a much better image with DLSS or XeSS than the basic TAA or FSR, so I would advise you to use XeSS with a 7900 Jerry and DLSS for the 4070 Super or DLAA. Taking a look at Star Citizen, and as we can see here, both cards are pretty close to each other, but as we know, Star Citizen is a really CPU EV game. I would still say the 4070 Super have a slight lead over the 7900 Jerry, because it's a DirectX 11 game, and most of the time, DirectX 11 means a win for the GeForce. That's the case once more. Spiderman Miles Morales now in high settings at 1440p as usual, and it seemed to be a win for the 4070 Super here. But once again, both cards are giving out more than 100 FPS average, so that's playable enough on both cards, but yeah, it seemed to be a win for the GeForce card here. And if you use ray tracing, no surprise whatsoever. As usual, the GeForce is doing better than the Radeon, but still, like with Ratchet and Clank, the 7900 Jerry isn't doing that bad. It's worse than the 4070 Super, but it's playable enough even without upscaling, so I think that's pretty good for both cards. And if we use upscaling regardless, well, obviously, the 4070 Super will do better than the 7900 Jerry performance-wise, but it's more the image quality that's much better with DLSS than FSR in these games. But the good news is that you don't really have to use upscaling, even with ray tracing with the 7900 Jerry, as we just saw earlier, so it's still a win overall for the 4070 Super, but the 7900 Jerry is doing well enough in this game. Moving on to Starfield now, and since the game release, the Radeons were doing better in this game. It's still the case now, the Jerry is doing better than the 4070 Super, but the Radeon's lead in this game is not as big as it used to be, so that's a pretty good thing overall. Both cards are pretty close overall, but it's still a win for the Jerry. Last of Us Part 1 now. Well, we know RGNA3 like this game a lot, and once again, yeah, it's a win for the 7900 Jerry. Both cards will do well enough in this game in high settings at 1440p. We are well above 60 FPS average, so definitely playable for both cards. A bit of an older game now, The Witcher 3, with the next generation patch, and as we can see, rasterization, it's a win for the 7900 Jerry. Both cards are still around 100 FPS average, but yeah, the game is much heavier than without the next gen patch. And if we use ray tracing in this game, well, the performance tanked quite a lot, and we can see now that the 4070 Super is slightly ahead of the 7900 Jerry, but as we saw in many games, we are under the 60 FPS average with ray tracing, so we will have to use DLSS and FSR to get there. And with upscaling enabled, well, yeah, we are now above 60 FPS average most of the time, but we are really close to the 60 FPS, so I guess sometimes the performance will drop below 60 FPS, which is a bit of a shame for a game that old. The optimization probably isn't that amazing, which is a bit sad. Taking a look at Valorant, another competitive game, and clearly the game is really light. It's not a heavyweight game, so you don't need that much graphical horsepower to play this game, and we can see that the 4070 Super and 7900 Jerry are really more than powerful enough, because if you look at the GPU utilization, we are clearly CPU bound here, so yeah, this game is a joke. Like a Dragon Gaiden, well, I like testing Yakuza games because it's a proprietary engine from Sega, and it's a bit different. So the 7900 Jerry is doing a bit better than the 4070 Super here, but it's really close on the wall. It's still a game that I like to use GLAA in because it makes the edges a bit cleaner than the game's TAA, and sadly FSR is not doing as good here, but if you use GSS with the 7900 Jerry, it will be about the same image quality wise as with the 4070 Super and DLSS. And I also wanted to take a quick look at Like a Dragon Infinite Wells, and here it's a bit the other way around. The 4070 Super is just slightly ahead of the 7900 Jerry, so we can see that depending on the scene, both cards will perform pretty much the same. So yeah, it's pretty much the same engine and pretty much the same performance. And closing up with Horizon Forbidden West, well, good news is that when the game released, the 7900 Jerry and RGNA3 cards were doing better than the GeForce cards, but since Nvidia added a new driver that added support for resizable bar, well, the GeForce are doing pretty good now, and it solved the 1% issues the game had with GeForce, and now the 4070 Super and 7900 Jerry are doing pretty much the same overall, so that's good news. So let's take a look at the graphs recap, and as you can see here, it matches what we were able to observe in the video. In some games the 4070 Super is ahead, and in some others it's a 7900 Jerry, but they are really quite close overall here. On the second graph, it's always more or less the same, aside from certain titles that stand out a little more, like God of War, where we find the problem with the lower 1% for the GeForce, that we could see in the video, and clearly the Jerry is doing better here. We also have some other games like Forza Horizon or Hitman 3 where the Jerry has a leg up on average performance, but not on the 1%, and sometimes like on Hogwarts Legacy, where the performance is unstable for both cards. Third graph, not much to say, it's once again very close for both cards. On the other hand, on the fourth graph, this is where I grouped a good part of the games with a lot of average FPS, so most of the competitive games, mostly because of Valorant, and it's more than 1000 FPS average, which almost make it look like 200 FPS in other games is low. But in short, for competitive games, once again, it depends. For Apex Legends, Battlefield 2042, Modern Warfare 2 and Rainbow Six Siege, it's a small lead for the GRE, and for Counter-Strike 2, Fortnite, Overwatch 2 and the finals, the 4070 Super has the edge. So once again, the two cards are fairly close, but if you are a big competitor in one of those games, yes, it's better to go for the card that performs better in your favorite game. With ray tracing on the other hand, obviously it's a clear win for the 4070 Super, since there is really no scenario where the 7900 GRE does better here. At best, it's almost equal in games where RT is really light, and at worst, it's significantly lower in the more RT-intensive games. And as we saw in the video, with path tracing, it's a clear win for the RTX. So yeah, if you want a card that's more capable in ray tracing, the 4070 Super is better equipped overall, even if, as we could see in the test, there is many games where we are not getting 60 FPS average without upscaling, so you will have to use it most of the time for both cards anyway. But even then, that would still be a win for the 4070 Super, given that DLSS produce better image quality than FSR, especially at 1440p. But overall, aside of those more extreme cases, the 7900 GRE doesn't do too bad in RT in my opinion. It's not its strong point, that's for sure, but it's often usable with some tweaking. And so we end at the overall recap on the 50 games. In Rasterization, it's a small lead of 1.2% for the GRE, but if we keep in mind that the XFX used is an OC model, while the 70 Super is a Founder Edition one, we can say that both cards are roughly on the same level of overall performance. In ray tracing, on the other hand, as we just saw, it's a clear win for the 4070 Super with 13% better on average, and if we combine Raster and RT, we end up with a slight lead of 3% for the 4070 Super, so all in all, it's pretty much the same. So yeah, it's interesting to see that by expanding the number of games in the end, the two cards remains really close anyway. So what could make you pick one over the other? Well, it's the same story since the start of this generation. Nvidia cards have the advantage in ray tracing, professional performance, upscaling, support for different technologies, RTX HDR, H264 streaming and energy efficiency, and resale price of cards since the GeForce tend to keep their value longer. And with AMD, there is an advantage with price to performance in rasterization and more VRAM. So as often, it all depends on what you do with your GPU, your budget, and your preferences. There really isn't a bad choice here as long as the hardware meets your needs. For the 12 gigs of RAM thing, which is often pointed out as a big issue with the 4070 Super, yes, 12 gigs is not generous. We would have liked more. However, my opinion on this, as I have already said in the past, is that at 1440p, it's not a disaster, and it should be enough until the next generation of consoles. Actual games are at the average VRAM need for the current generation, since even the PS5 Pro is supposed to have the same amount of total memory, so I don't think games will suddenly require more VRAM out of the blue. It shouldn't change much anymore for a couple of years, aside from a few games from time to time, which could be needing more. We have more than likely reached the average VRAM use for the current generation. And subsequently, we should find the same scenario as what happened with the current generation of console, where we had a long period of cross-gen games where 8 gigs cards were still doing the job. The more demanding games arrived gradually, and those games had higher VRAM demands, and it's mainly the 8 gigs cards that run into issues in those games. So at 1440p, for me, 12 gigs will be enough, with sometimes having to do some tweaking until the next generation of console, where more concession will have to be made. But we are talking at around a 3 to 5 years window, so that's still a while to go. And I think it will be more of a problem for 12 gigs card if Nvidia releases an RTX 6070 with 12 gigs of VRAM at the launch of the next generation of console. That would look pretty much like the 3070 with its 8 gigs when the PS5 released, for example. I hope they don't make the same mistake again. But yeah, unless you plan to keep your card for 10 years, 12 gigs of RAM will be okay at 1440p, even if yes, sometimes you may have to lower some settings. And at 4K, however, yeah, you are better off with 16 gigs of VRAM, but both cards already need lower settings to perform decently at 4K without going for upscaling. And if your aim is native 4K, you will need more powerful cards anyway, unless you play mainly older games. So anyway, I think we have seen what we had to do here for those two cards, and so tell me in the comments if this format interested you. Otherwise, as usual, if you want to give strength to the channel, the YouTube stuff, subscription, likes, and other stuff, it's stupid, but it helps. And for those that want to support me directly, the channel's Ko-fi page, and as always, a huge thank you to those that contribute. It helps me a ton. And I will see you soon for some other videos. Take care of yourselves. Bye.